Good day. In my previous video, I spoke about some very confusing information that appeared to be trickling out from Kherson region and from Bakhmut city, perhaps the two most important battlefields in the conflict in Ukraine at the present time. I say Ukraine, let me reiterate again that as of the first days of October, the Russian government considers these territories to be part of Russia. Well, in Kherson region, we were getting reports that the Russian authorities, or some confusing reports about the Russian authorities evacuating civilians from Kherson city. And this led to claims, especially in the British media, that the Russians, that their position in Kherson city, in Kherson region, was collapsing, that they were planning to withdraw to the east bank of the Dnieper River, and that this was the explanation for this evacuation. We then got a whole series of reports from other Russian officials in Kherson city, which appear to contradict this. And by the way, there's been another report, there was another report which appeared on the official Russian news agency TASS, which came out after I did my video, which seemed to downplay the nature of any evacuation from Kherson city even further. Anyway, that was one report, and then there was other reports from Bakhmut city, which is the other area of the major fighting in Ukraine at the moment. And there were claims coming from Bakhmut city, some claims that Ukrainian forces were withdrawing from Bakhmut city, which was in that case going to be surrendered to the Russians. And then there were other claims, contradictory claims, that the Ukrainians were reinforcing their positions in Bakhmut city. Well, today we've got more clarity. Firstly, let's turn to the situation in Kherson region. Overnight, the Ukrainian military launched another attack heading towards Kherson city. It's difficult to say exactly how many troops were involved. There have been all kinds of extraordinary figures, up to 60,000, which, by the way, I don't believe. 60,000 troops who were supposed to be involved in this offensive. The only figure that I've seen, which seems to me credible, is that 25 tanks participated in this attack. Now, again, we're getting reports from the Russian side, and I stress they are from the Russian side, and they are only obviously correct, or if they are correct, they're only up to date as of the time of making of this video. By the time it's published, the situation may have changed completely. But as of the time of making of this video, it seems that this Ukrainian attack on Kherson city has been repelled, or at least on Kherson region, the Russian positions in Kherson region has been repelled. However, there's also a general feeling that this is merely the start of a whole series of Ukrainian attacks, and that the Ukrainians seem to be trying to restart their offensive in Kherson region in some way. The Russians, however, and I'm taking this entirely from Russian commentaries, seem much more confident this time that they can withstand this attack. One gets the sense that Russian positions in Kherson region have been significantly reinforced, and one also gets the sense that they have a fairly clear idea of what it is that the Ukrainian military are trying to do. Well, that's what we've here. I can't give you more information than this at the moment. As I said, this is an evolving situation. But for the record, and just to clarify and tie up the loose ends from yesterday's video, I now think that evacuation decision was in some way connected with this Ukrainian offensive. Clearly the Russians got information that it was coming, and they took the precaution of starting some kind of evacuation of civilians from Kherson city, though perhaps as the situation has developed, they become more confident that an evacuation will not be needed. Now, this offensive is taking place in the middle of October, and, you know, over the last couple of weeks, we've been hearing endless reports which I've taken, you know, as true, that with the autumn rains, with the ground becoming softer, Ukrainian advances across the open steppe in Kherson region are going to become increasingly difficult. And for all I know, that is actually the case. But there is perhaps another factor which might be useful for taking into account, because I was also reading on various channels, and this originates from Ukrainian sources now, that the Biden administration has been piling on pressure on the Ukrainian authorities to launch some kind of attack and to try to capture or recapture Kherson city before the midterm elections in the United States on the 8th of October. And this is presumably in disregard of losses to the Ukrainian forces, and presumably also in disregard of whatever muddy conditions there might also be in relation to the Kherson region and whatever difficulties that creates. And that might be true, and it might also explain something else, which is a number of rather curious reports which I've been reading in the Financial Times, a British newspaper, but one which I've long come to realize has pretty close contacts with the Biden administration. Over the last couple of days, it's been publishing reports about Ukraine recapturing Kherson city by as soon as next week. And it also published a report about a week ago in which it spoke of Ukraine having until mid-November to try to capture Kherson city. Supposedly the climatic conditions would then become impossible by mid-November to continue with offensives. Now, that last made very little sense to me, because I'd always understood that the real problem was not the frosts and the cold, which would harden the ground and make tanks capable of moving, so that actually as the weather gets colder, conditions for offensives become easier rather than more difficult. So mid-November seemed a strange date, but thinking about that overnight and in light of the Ukrainian attacks today, I wonder whether, and the suggestion that the Biden administration wants the Kherson city recaptured before the midterms, whether this reference to mid-November is in fact that the real point about mid-November, that mid-November time limit, is that in fact the real time limit, the real reason why it's said that Ukraine only has up to mid-November to capture Kherson city is not because of the deterioration of the climate, the weather conditions, as that Financial Times article suggested, but because, of course, the midterms take place on the 8th of November. And, of course, there does seem to be a groundswell of opposition in the United States to more funding for Ukraine. Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, AOC, the progressive Democrat, was recently heckled by a left-wing audience in the United States because of her support for funding for Ukraine and for the Ukraine war. And there does also seem to be more opposition now building up in the Republican Party, which is expected to make heavy gains in the congressional midterms. And it could be that the real concern of the Biden administration is not that weather conditions are going to make further Ukrainian offensives impossible by mid-November, but that if the Republicans sweep the midterm on the 8th of November, and if the political mood in the United States changes, then it might be much more difficult to persuade the future Congress, which convenes in January of 2023, and indeed even the existing Congress, which obviously remains in place until January 2023. It might make it very difficult for to persuade Congress to continue to supply, to fund more weapons supplies to Ukraine. So that may be what's causing the real deadline. That's the real timetable, what is dictating the timetable, and what explains these attacks in Kherson region. So that, it seems to me, is the overall situation in Kherson region. There is a second fact, there's something else, which is now the Bakhmut city situation, which I also discussed yesterday. Well, over the last few hours, again, we got clarity. Some Ukrainian troops were pulled out of Bakhmut city, but they were not. There's no general withdrawal from Bakhmut city. This is a rotation of troops. Apparently, troops who've been fighting in Bakhmut city and have suffered heavy losses and are tired are now being replaced by fresher forces, so that the Ukrainian defense of Bakhmut city continues. It continues even though the information continues to be of a gathering crisis for Ukrainian forces trying to defend Bakhmut city. Well, that, I think, is the clarity. I don't have much more information about what's going on there, but that does settle the issue about some of that information that I was discussing yesterday. Now, we've also had a rather interesting press conference in Astana from President Putin. And President Putin comes along and he gives his press conferences every so often, and they do sometimes provide an insight into what he's thinking. Now, I have to say, this particular press conference seemed to me to be rather more careful in giving away information than some of the press conferences that he's given in the past. So, for example, when he was asked what the underlying objectives are in Ukraine, whether there's a plan to change radically the whole political structure of Ukraine or to even annex Ukraine, he simply said very briefly that there is no plan. There's never been a plan. There's never been any intention to occupy the whole of Ukraine. Now, that simply repeats what he's been saying all along. It may or it may not reflect changes in the Russian position, but if there have been changes in the Russian position, obviously that's being kept secret for the moment. And that, I have to say, wouldn't surprise me, given that a sudden Russian announcement now that Russia has changed its objectives and is heading towards the occupation of the entirety of Ukraine, well, would not be well received by the international community, including by Russia's friends. So there was that statement. And again, he talked about the mobilization. He accepted, as the Russians have never denied, that there have been teething problems. He blamed it on the fact that there were problems with some of the material, the documentation used to carry out the mobilization. One gets the sense that some of the paperwork dates back to the Soviet era and hasn't been updated. But anyway, he seemed to suggest that the mobilization is now on track. 220,000 people have already been called up. He expects that the process will be fully completed within the next 2 weeks. He also suggested that there would be no need for a further mobilization beyond this one. And he said, he again gave the impression that the mobilization was being carried out for no other purpose than to defend the existing front line. But then again, that's unsurprising, because if there are offensive intentions on the part of the Russians, one would assume that Putin would not want to discuss them in a press conference. He wouldn't disclose whatever plans he and the general staff might have over the course of a press conference like this. So that's unsurprising again. Similarly, he appeared to suggest that the missile strikes, which continue as of the time of speaking at something like the same tempo, that they're not going to, they will soon end. Most of the targets, 22 out of the 29 targets which were being attacked, have now been irretrievably destroyed. That's according to Putin. There's only 7 more left, and that there's no intention for further massive missile strikes at this time. Again, all I will say is that appears to me to correspond with the analysis of people like John Helmer, which I think is the more correct one, that missile strikes, I suspect they will continue at a higher tempo than before for the next couple of weeks. But the really big missile strikes, the really massive missile strikes, are not happening yet. These missile strikes are certainly intended to cause a certain amount of damage to Ukraine's infrastructure and to its positions, to its civilian infrastructure and air defense systems and all of that. But the basic intention is to find out how Ukraine responds to these missile strikes, how long it takes Ukraine to repair damage done, what kind of materials it uses, where those materials are, who the experts are, that kind of thing, so that when the really big attack is made in a few weeks, it will be more effective than it would otherwise be. And I think that is, again, consistent, as I said, with that analysis, which, let me repeat again, I've got from John Helmer. So those are the things that Putin said. As I said, I don't think they broke very much new ground. But he did say 2 things which were interesting. He said that 16,000 reservists are now back with their units, their original units, and they're engaging on the battlefield. They're actually fighting, and that, I am sure, are the people who were serving in the military up to a few months ago. They've been called up, and one can already see that they're being put back into the front line or into the forces, and that's already thickening out Russian defences. And apparently there's another 33,000 reservists who've joined their units. They're still going through the training process. Again, these are people who probably have been in the military fairly recently and probably don't require an enormous amount of training. Of course, hundreds of thousands more on the way. So the process is still ongoing, but within about 2 weeks' time, we will see Russian forces in Ukraine reinforced by around 50,000 men from this call-up. And of course, there's more other soldiers also coming from Chechnya. Ramzan Kadyrov says 70,000 in total. I take that figure with a big pinch of salt. And of course, there's also more troops who are now joining the Wagner organization, though I am not going to speculate too much about all of that. So that's the situation on the battlefronts. There's one further portioned piece of news, which is that the first echelon of the Russian force, which has been deployed to Belarus, has apparently arrived there. That's presumably these 1,000 men, a headquarters party and a logistics party that we talked about. But it seems almost certain that thousands more are coming. And what makes this deployment different from the one we saw in the winter, in advance of the Russian strike towards Kiev, which took place in the winter, in February and March, what makes this one different is that apparently a joint force is now being created, integrating at least a part of the Belarusian military with the Russian military. Now, we don't know what the purpose of this force is. The Russians and the Belarusians are talking about it as being defensive. The Ukrainians and the West are much more nervous, and I'm sure that they're worrying that another strike south towards Kiev or perhaps towards other places may soon be on its way. Anyway, the Russians are not enlightening us, and we shouldn't be surprised about that. Now, that's, it seems to me, the situation on the battlefronts. I'm going, at least as of the time of making of this video, let me repeat again, this is an evolving situation, especially in Kherson region. We will no doubt learn a great deal more over the next couple of hours. We'll see whether Ukraine is able to make a breakthrough in Kherson region and how the Russians respond to that, if they do, or alternatively, we will see whether the Russian lines do indeed hold, as they seem to be holding at the moment, and how the Ukrainians in that case respond to that. So that's, as I said, an evolving situation, and you may have more information about all of this by the time this video is published. As I said, I make these videos in the morning, or at least the morning in London. By the evening, the situation can be completely different. So that's all I can do. I can't give you continuous information. I'm not in a position to do that. You must wait for my next commentary as the position changes. I do want to say a few things about the political situation in two particular countries. The first is France, where there is now an ongoing strike by French workers in refineries, and this is creating a serious gas and petrol shortage in French filling stations. And President Macron of France did what he often does. He gave a very confrontational interview on French television. He said at one and the same time that the French government does not involve itself in disputes over pay between French workers and their employers. And then he went on to make it fairly clear that it is going to involve itself and essentially take action against these striking workers. And there's even reports now that the French government, Macron's government, is contemplating deploying the French military to try to break these strikes, something which I think the French military would be extremely unhappy if they were ordered to do. I've never heard of them being ordered to do a thing like that at any time since the Second World War. The closest we got to that was in 1968 during the protests then, when French President de Gaulle did consider deploying the army and had to negotiate with the military leadership and agree political concessions in order to get them to agree to that, though thankfully the crisis was resolved and it never quite happened. So Macron seems to be heading in the same direction, or at least there are reports that he is. This is not being well received, or so I understand it, amongst many people in France, and there's now reports of a day of action being prepared on the 18th of October. In other words, in effect, a general strike on that day. So we're looking at a very volatile situation in France, but yet again, Macron, the French political establishment, because it's not just Macron, instead of responding to the underlying causes of the protests, the strikes, their responses are becoming increasingly threatening and authoritarian. And I wonder whether that will change, and I wonder where things in France are heading. For the record, and as I've already said in a program I did with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou on the Duran, I think that this is a more critical situation for the French government than the Yellow Vest protests of a few years ago. This movement seems to be much more broadly based. It involves urban workers. I think the potential challenge is greater, and that's perhaps why we're hearing talk of the military being called in. Anyway, that's the situation in France. Now, the other country I just want to talk about briefly is Britain. Now, a couple of days ago, I did a program on the Duran with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou. I expressed the view, which I've also mentioned in videos on this channel, that there was clearly some kind of a plot being hatched against the Liz Truss quasi-Kwarteng government. And that is what provoked that comment, that thought, that view on my part, was the extraordinary action of the Governor of the Bank of England, Andrew Bailey, who came and made a statement on Monday, an entirely unnecessary statement, in which he said not only that the Bank of England's bond buying programme in the British sovereign bond market would end on Friday, on the 14th of October, which it, by the way, has done, but that British pension funds, which are severely exposed because of investment decisions they took in the bond market, that British pension funds only had until Friday to sort out their positions. Now, it seemed to me that statement was clearly intended to create a sense of crisis, which, by the way, it did. There was an immediate fall in the pound. There was more problems in the bond market, and that clearly the plan was to force a change of course on the part of the British government. In other words, to get the Truss-Kwarteng government to reverse the mini budget that they announced 3 weeks ago, to end the tax changes that they announced, to go back, in effect, on their entire economic plan. And I would add, by the way, that this action by the Bank of England comes on top of a sustained campaign against the Truss-Kwarteng government. And there was an extraordinary report, by the way, after the mini-budget from the Institute of Fiscal Studies, a non-government organisation which regularly publishes forecasts based on government announcements of where Britain's fiscal position is heading, and which, for the record, I think wields an unhealthy amount of influence in British economic decision-making. But anyway, there was an extraordinary statement after the mini-budget by the Institute of Fiscal Studies, an extraordinarily alarmist one, in my opinion. And I say that as somebody who disagrees completely with the Truss-Kwarteng government's economic strategy. I think it's misconceived in these high inflation times, and I didn't agree with what they did. I didn't agree with the policies of the mini-budget, but I did nonetheless find the claims about the supposed catastrophic deterioration of the British government's financial position excessively alarmist, even worse, much worse, in fact, than the already bad reality pointed to. And that was also, in my opinion, partly intended to create a sense of crisis around that mini budget. Now, the Bank of England would not have acted in the way that it did. Its governor would not have acted in the way that it did. This is my opinion, I should stress, unless it had support, unless it had talked about the situation, there had been discussions about the situation with other prominent players in the British political system. I'm not going to try and put names to people, I don't have those names. But certainly I can't imagine that the Bank of England would have acted in the way that it did unless it felt that it had political cover for its moves. And clearly the intention, as I said, was to force a reversal of British government policy, economic policy. But in doing that, they would have known that if economic policy was reversed in the way that it was, then the Chancellor, the British Finance Minister, Kwasi Kwarteng, who is identified with this economic policy, his position would be untenable and he would have to go. And of course, looking beyond that, if the economic policy is reversed, if the Chancellor is forced to go, it's difficult to see how the Prime Minister, Liz Truss, who is also identified with these policies, how she can survive for very long. So the overall objective, and I can't believe that the Bank of England wasn't aware of this and that the people it's been working with aren't aware of this, the overall objective, or so it seems to me, must be to force not just a change in policy by the British government, but in effect a change of government. In other words, to oust not just the Chancellor, but the Prime Minister as well. And as I made very clear in a programme I did on the Duran, though I don't agree with the original economic policy of the Truss Kwarteng government, though I don't have any liking for the Truss Kwarteng government, though I think Liz Truss is a totally inappropriate person to make as Prime Minister. I don't like the way in which this has been done. I think that for institutions, the institutions of the permanent state, the Bank of England, dare I say it, the Institute of Fiscal Studies, though it is not an institution in theory of the British state, but it's almost come to acquire something of that quality. For all of these institutions to work in that way, to work to bring a government down in that fashion, that makes me distinctly unhappy and uncomfortable. I would add that Kwarteng was working as Chancellor on issuing a financial statement, I believe on the 31st of October, just a few weeks away, in which he would have set out his plans to try to bring the British finances, the government's finances back into order. Perhaps that would have been right, perhaps that would have satisfied people, perhaps it wouldn't. But certainly it seems to me that to precipitate a crisis in the way that the Bank of England did, whilst the Chancellor was still working on his plans and was preparing to announce his plans on the 31st of October, was completely inappropriate for the permanent state to do. Now, if the Chancellor had come forward on the 31st of October, announced his plans, if those plans had turned out to be hopeless, then maybe at that point some kind of political challenge from within the political system might have been appropriate, especially if the markets had reacted badly. But to take action in the way that was done over the course of this week that's passing, before the Chancellor had even had a chance to settle things, and at a time when the situation in the financial markets had stabilized, all of that, to my mind, clearly points to a concerted attempt to create a crisis in order to get first the Chancellor sacked and then ultimately the Prime Minister sacked. Well, if I'm right in my analysis, and I am absolutely sure I am, then the plotters are succeeding. Yesterday, the Chancellor was dismissed. Now, he didn't resign. His statement makes it absolutely clear that he was forced out. The Prime Minister told him that he had to go, and he said that having heard that, he agreed to step aside. He was apparently he was in Washington when all of these moves were made. Notice that the plotters struck whilst he was away. Obviously something that was, again, in my opinion, hardly a coincidence, that he wasn't there to tour the studios, talk to the British people, speak to Conservative MPs, try to rally support, try to give reassurance. The Bank of England acted whilst they knew that he was away and would not be able to do any of those things. But anyway, he was called back from Washington. He was not given any indication on his way that he was about to be sacked. He arrived in London, had a brief meeting with the Prime Minister, and was in effect sacked. And we've now had a new Chancellor appointed, Jeremy Hunt, who is someone with no background in finance or economics. He's been foreign minister. I believe he's an ex-diplomat. I might be wrong about that. But we hear all sorts of things about how he's a steady pair of hands who's going to bring the whole situation back under control. The important thing is he's not close politically to Liz Truss. And of course, Liz Truss then gave an 8-minute press conference, which I think by universal consent was a disaster. She came across as enormously unconvincing. She only fielded 4 questions and gave the same answer to each of those questions, even though those questions were different. She gave a very poor impression. I personally think she will be very lucky indeed if she's still Prime Minister in a week's time. So we see that the plot is succeeding, the permanent state, the people on the Conservative backbenches who are also involved in this, some ministers as well, they're winning. They reversed the policies of the British government. They've got the Chancellor sacked. They're now clearly working towards removing the Prime Minister. Now, why am I unhappy about this? I don't like Liz Truss. I don't think she should ever have been Prime Minister. I think it's a massive mistake to make her Prime Minister. I disagreed completely with the government's economic policies. I felt that it would increase inflation, extra spending, more tax cuts, would increase demand at a time when inflation is already high. And frankly, I think this is a wrong policy. Well, I've already given some reasons. I don't like it when the permanent state acts in the way that it has. I think the Chancellor, at least, should have been given time to present his ideas. And besides, as somebody who's has, shall we say, knowledge of plots. I don't like plots and intrigues anyway. I think that they're an unhealthy thing in politics. There is another reason why I'm unhappy about this. Misguided and wrong, though I think Truss and Kwarteng were, and though I feel that the solutions that they were offering were the wrong solutions, at least they do recognise that there is a major problem with the British economy, that the British economy is in deep crisis. And this is a crisis that has been building up over a very long time, but which has certainly got much worse over the last year or so, what with the economic war against Russia. Their prescriptions may be wrong, but they at least do recognise the crisis. What we have seen, again, and we see this not just in Britain, we've seen this in the United States as well with Donald Trump, is that whenever somebody comes, Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders, I should say as well, whenever anybody from outside the political class or from the wings, the left or right wings of the political class, be it Jeremy Corbyn or Bernie Sanders from the left, be it Liz Truss and Donald Trump from the right, managed to get at least into office, always note, with support from the grassroots. Truss and Corbyn were both elected leaders of their respective parties by the membership of those parties. Donald Trump won a bitterly contested election in 2016 and always had a strong amount of grassroots support in the United States. And Bernie Sanders had a lot of support from activists and young people within the Democratic Party's electoral coalition. Whenever people like that manage to gain office, gain positions of political leadership, the institutions of the permanent state, including, by the way, in Britain, the parliamentary parties, Conservative and Labour, and in the United States, the congressional leaderships of the Democratic and Republican parties, and of course the media in both countries, they combine against them. And these elected leaders then face concerted attack, and in every single case up to now, they're pushed out. Now, I don't always agree with what these people are trying to do, but what inevitably results from this is that we end up with the unsustainable status quo. And worse still, it becomes more and more difficult in these conditions to conduct any intelligent political debate, to discuss options, to look for options, to present electorates in the United States and Britain. And by the way, the same is true increasingly of many European countries as well, Germany being a case in point, with options which deviate from the establishment orthodoxies. The Overton window, if you like, of debate is being narrowed all the time. And this, it seems to me, is a disaster. It means that we carry on exactly as we have been doing for the last 30 plus years. We continue along the same route course, and things just go on deteriorating around us. If there was a more open debate, if Truss and Kwarteng had been allowed to do that which they were elected by their party membership to do, and which, by the way, has some support within British society, even though I think that is wrong. It's conceivable, in fact, it's likely that there would have been a political response from the left, who knows from where. There might have been a political debate, some ideas might have come forward, some change of policies might have happened. Perhaps in time, people might even have started to ask serious questions about the wisdom of the economic war that is being waged at the present time. But by engineering, in effect, the collapse of a government just 6 weeks after it's been established, however inadequate that government is, that debate, that opportunity for debate is being closed. And this is a very bad thing. It is contrary, in my opinion, to the whole nature of democracy and erodes democracy even further. Well, that's all I'm going to say about this. I appreciate, as I said, that Liz Truss has few fans. I want to make it very clear I'm not a fan at all. I think, as I said, she should never had become Prime Minister. I don't personally think that she was ever up to the job of being Prime Minister at all. I think a disastrous press conference of yesterday, Friday, apparently an equally disastrous, perhaps even worse meeting that she had with her parliamentary party on Wednesday. They exposed the extent of her own inadequacy. But there it is. I may not like the regime, but there is regime change, which is what we're seeing. And then there is the proper removal of a government through constitutional and democratic processes. The second, I favour, because, as I said, it opens up debate. It gives the sovereign people and their representatives their constitutional role. The other, regime change of government through intrigues, I don't like, because it is in effect the extinguishment of the first, of that democratic process in which I firmly believe. So let me repeat again, I'm no fan of Liz Truss. I don't agree with Kwarteng's economic policies. I think they were all mistaken and misconceived. But there we are. That's where we are. It's the closing of the window of debate that concerns me. Now, that's all I'm going to say. As I said, most of these programs that I've been doing, about nearly all of them recently, have been about Ukraine, and I have talked about Ukraine quite extensively in this video. But Britain is obviously the country where I live, so I do want to talk about what has just happened here, and of course people in the United States where similar things have happened. Perhaps they will understand some of the points I'm making there as well. Anyway, that's me for the day. As I said, by this evening, things may be looking very different in Ukraine from what they are this morning. So you'll just have to wait, I'm afraid, until my next video, probably tomorrow, in which I can discuss them. But that's me for the day. More from me soon. In the meantime, remember, you can find us on other platforms, Locals, Rumble, ODYSEE, BitChute, Telegram, and of course we're also now on Rofkin, and you can find us on Rofkin as well. The links under this video. You should also remember that on every Wednesday I do programs on live streams exclusively on Locals. That's just me. And if you want to talk about things, discuss things, put things to me, ask me questions, engage with the rest of the Duran community, you can join us on Locals. Live streams happen 1400 hours Eastern Standard Time every Wednesday. That is, for the moment, 1900 hours London time. Do note that the times are going to change fairly soon. We're into the period when countries move from summertime to wintertime. Anyway, in addition, if you want to support our work, remember you can do so via Patreon and Subscribestar. You'll find links under this video. You can also check out our shop, where you have all the great things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, and all of those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me from the day, more from me soon, and have a very good day until we speak again.